that you don't overreact, that you don't use a sledgehammer when a tack hammer would be able to be used when you change the law. So when we now deal with the Woodmansee case, we don't want to go ahead and change our laws drastically in response to that. That affects everybody, not just him, but we want to make sure that we don't have a situation again where somebody who's done what he has done is going to be able to get out with 12 years shaved off of his prison sentence.
Good behavior following that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Jackie, do you want to set up that case? And
what's happened is back in the 80s, early 80s, Michael Woodmansee committed murder on a young boy by the name of Jason Foreman, age 5. They, several years later, discovered his body in his home. They ultimately prosecuted him. He pled to I forget what second degree murder. Yeah, and so they, as part of the plea agreement, he was sentenced to 40 years in life, 40 years in prison. Fast forward to today, because we have a statute on our books that entitles prisoners for time off for good behavior. Now, Michael Woodmansee is able to be released 12 years early. So now you have the community who's outraged in public outcry. Consequently, we have legislators, someone in the Senate, I believe, who is proposing legislation to fix that gap, so to speak, so that if there's a heinous crime committed on a child, that criminal would be excluded from the law. As it stands today, Woodmansee is not excluded from the law, and I think we were talking about this on the way up. Mm-hmm. Is it because he wasn't convicted of child molestation, or was it because it was just second-degree murder?
Because the statute already excludes certain crimes from the good
behavior.
Yeah, yeah. However, now, we should change the law if that's what's appropriate. I don't know how you apply it retroactively or ex post facto, because that's not an appropriate application of law. However, before you go ahead and change it, if you're the legislature, I would implore you to make sure you have people from the ACI who are experts in prisons testify, because there's a reason that that's in the law in the first place, to control behavior of people who are in prison. And it's a very effective way of making sure that the prison population, there's some control over what's going on there.
I think the way the proposed legislation reads right now is there wouldn't be any ex post facto effect, except that it would apply to people that are in prison right now, currently serving time. Okay. But not in the situation where it would be with Woodmansee.
It's a close call.
Yeah.
I think that since it may be a regulation and not part of the punishment, you might be able to get away with doing that because you're not changing the punishment, so to speak. You're changing the application of how the punishment is applied. So that's a possibility. However, again, bring the prison experts in to make sure that you understand what effect that's going to have on their ability to do their job. And I think there are probably other ways, I would hope that there are other ways, that you could keep this guy from ever seeing the light of day, because even if you are able to take away some of what he's already acquired in terms of rights to get out, a 40-year sentence, he's got the potential to get out anyway.
So that would be a good example of having a psychological exam.
Perhaps.
The way the law reads right now, if you're sentenced for 6 months or more, but not life in prison, for every day of good behavior, you can get up to 10 days off a month.
That's the good behavior law as it stands right now.
So now they've ultimately taken up to 12 years off his sentence.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a reason, like I said, for that, because you're encouraging good behavior. You want people to participate in prison activities that are work or educational related, and you want to encourage the best possible result of their prison time when you're trying to rehabilitate someone to get them out of prison.
Yes.
But on the other hand, you don't want to let a monster out of prison.
Apparently, even if the proposed law is changed, Woodmansee doesn't entirely...
It's not applied.
It's not applying to him. However, there's apparently a moratorium that they're trying to put through right now, which if it goes into effect, at least it will buy the time that allows them to get the psychiatrist involved or whatever, so that they can effectively find a way, a loophole, a way to circumvent the situation. It's terrible that you should have to circumvent the situation, but to keep him off the streets and away from doing harm again. And when you talk about good behavior, I think it's very interesting, as they point out some of the differences in the behaviors of the human beings, such as Craig Price and Michael Woodmansee. You could see where one could have easily been goaded by a guard and he would slug somebody back and therefore manage to have additional bad behavior and additional criminal time. But someone else who has a different type of behavior is less likely to be goaded into it, maybe doesn't even have that kind of disposition, so you have to find yet another way to circumvent. It seems that this makes the justice system a very difficult thing to play out, even though each is supposed to be entitled to due process. They are getting due process, but at what cost?
Well, again, the difficulty comes when you try to apply the law to an individual and only that individual, rather than this is the law for society in general, and we want to make sure that it's a law that's appropriate for society in general. And if there is a person in your society, such as a Woodmansee, that there's the ability to punish appropriately. But you can't apply laws ex post facto. Just take an example. Perhaps someone pleads guilty 10 years ago to driving under the influence.
As a child or
No,
adult?
as an adult.
Okay.
And the crime calls for a punishment. I'm just giving an example of what ex post facto application of the law that's illegal would be. Calls for a suspension of your license for a certain amount of time. And as society has progressed, we have now put a much more emphasis on not allowing that behavior. So if the DUI sentence that this guy applied, was given and agreed to plead to, even though maybe he had some defenses, was, I'm going to lose my license for 3 months. If the law has changed and it says now it's 2 years, and this guy pleaded 10 years ago, and they say, and we're going to apply it to everyone who pleaded within the last 10 years. Well, that's not the agreement he made. So you could see someone like Woodmansee arguing, a lawyer on his behalf, well, wait, I made an agreement. At the time I made the agreement, I pleaded. The rules were 40 years and time off for good behavior. I knew what I was pleading to. That's the deal I made. Now you're changing my deal. You can change parts of that deal. But you couldn't, for instance, say anyone who pleaded and tried to create, specific facts on the law to this guy who pleaded to doing this and kept a journal and did this, that, and the other thing is now subject to the death penalty, for example. That's not what he pleaded to. That's not the agreement he made. But there are ways of keeping someone like that locked up forever, and you have to find those ways and do it in such a way that it doesn't affect everyone else's rights.
I think what the intention was is for those that are incarcerated, they will no longer be subject to that type of credit or good time behavior, but the credit that they have now, if I understand you correctly, cannot be taken away from them. And I think that's what the law says, to address that problem. So it's not really relation back, but I agree with you. You can't, if you relate back, now you're opening a can of worms, and much legislation will result.
We've been focusing on the criminals. What about the family of the criminals? Was there anything in the law at the time that would have allowed the family who decided we don't want every little detail of that barbarous murder to be divulged, and for that we will grant this? What provision is there for the family to know what options that they could explore before they made the decision just to spare their family and whomever else the hurt and the horrible story as it unfolded? Now these people are in a situation where there could be a parole, or someone could be back out in the street because they didn't know maybe all of the options.
Right.
That would be up to the prosecutor and the Attorney General's office to just
explain
that, correct.
At that time, you would hope, and I'm sure this may have happened, and I totally understand where the family would have been at that time, in the sense that it's horrific, you don't want to relive it, you don't want, all of these things coming out, but you would have hoped that the prosecutor explained, if we agree to this, this is the consequence of that. The